Hi, and welcome to the Heart of a Perfectionist podcast. I'm your host, Tegan Thompson. I'm a book lover, a chocoholic, and an INTJ living in a world filled with extroverts. I made this podcast to share my experiences and struggles as an introverted perfectionist, and to bring the inner workings of an introvert's mind to introverts and extroverts alike. So grab a cup of tea and get comfortable. It's time to unmute. Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Heart of a Perfectionist podcast. I just got done working out, so I'm kind of a little tired, but I'm kind of excited for this episode. This week we'll be talking about some of the differences between introverts and extroverts when it comes to communicating, and also talking about some helpful tips when you are communicating with an introvert. So just gonna dive right on in and start discussing this. So starting with one difference, and a major difference that I thought I should talk about, is phone calls. And for extroverts, phone calls are, these exciting adventures that they can take with this person that they're talking to, right? You don't know where the conversation's going, so it's kind of like, ooh, it's a surprise, right? You never know, right? And these are things that introverts don't like, right? Introverts are planners, so talking on the phone can be really stressful for them when the conversation is both unknown / a surprise, and requires quick responses, quick thinking, which is like the opposite of an introvert's intuition, right? They want to think about their responses. They want to know exactly how they're going to respond, why they're responding that way. Think of every possibility of what they want to include in their response, right? So phone calls just make that really difficult, because you can't sit there on the phone in silence for a minute after someone says something, thinking about what you want to say, and then be like, oh yeah, blah, 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 blah. Right? That just makes the phone call a little weird. Also, aside from the endless small talk that occurs during phone calls, and don't even get me started on that, introverts have a lack of visual cues when they're on the phone, which makes it really difficult for introverts to focus on the conversation and to gauge the other individuals' emotions and kind of just their general state of being. And this is because introverts are observers, right? They like to observe things, see people's reactions, beyond just hearing the words and their voice, right? You can get a lot from their tone of voice and everything, but having that extra level of cues, being able to see them, those nonverbal cues, is really helpful for introverts, especially when people are pretty good at hiding their emotions when they're talking. And so just kind of to give an example of phone calls, from an introvert's perspective, my friend just a week ago called me out of nowhere, and I looked at my phone and I was like, what the heck? Why are they calling me? There's no need to call me. And I didn't know what to do because I didn't want to talk to them on the phone. And so honestly, just to be completely honest with you, I just ignored it and let it go to voicemail. And then she texted me and she goes, oh wow, you didn't want to answer the phone. And I was just kind of honest with her. I was like, no, I didn't. I don't like talking on the phone. I absolutely hate it. So no. And she goes, but what if it was an emergency? And I was like, honestly, if it's an emergency, you can leave me a voicemail or text me really quick and I'll call you back. At least in that case, I'm prepared and I know generally what the conversation is going to be about, or what we need to discuss, kind of that kind of stuff, right? So, just kind of a general rule, a general tip when it comes to phone calls and introverts, it's super important to either talk to them beforehand or text them before you just call them to talk to them on the phone, because they need that preparation, even if it's like not being able to prepare for what they're going to respond with because they don't know what the conversation is still going to be about. At least they can mentally prepare for a conversation, and it's not a surprise, because introverts also just generally hate surprises, again, because they're planners and they like to plan things, and surprises ruin plans. So yeah, give them a heads up, let them know that you want to talk to them on the phone, and if possible, talking them through FaceTime or some other video feature. I know like Snapchat has it, is also helpful, just so that they can see your face and your reactions and kind of your nonverbal cues, right? Okay, so phone calls. Introverts and extroverts are completely opposite with those things. The next thing is small talk, and that's why I didn't get into it before, because I'm going to talk about small talk. So, like, extroverts get energy from socialization. So small talk, or just talking in general, no matter what it's about, right, will be appealing for them. However, introverts often become mentally drained by small talk and often feel like it's kind of meaningless to them. And this is because introverts prefer conversations with a lot of depth, by discussing things like philosophy or science or ideas, or just anything that you can really like dig deep into and kind of get other people's perspectives and thoughts on things. So, my tip for this is, while extroverts should look to kind of engage in more conversations that are deep and can go in depth with introverts, introverts should also be mindful of the importance small talk has with extroverts. So it's always just important to be mindful and respectful of every person's desires and needs when it comes to communicating. And while introverts may need that in-depth conversation to really stimulate them and drive them to continue a conversation, extroverts may need to start it with small talk so that they can kind of just like, get that energy rolling so that they can have that in-depth conversation. Because it's not that extroverts can't. Extroverts definitely can have in-depth conversations. It's just they also enjoy the small talk. So, extroverts should be mindful that introverts need that in-depth conversation, and introverts should be mindful that extroverts enjoy the small talk. So some other just general helpful tips when it comes to communicating with introverts is active listening. While extroverts like the attention of people listening to them, introverts like to know you're interested in the conversation and that they are being understood. For me, when people don't really show interest in a conversation or what I'm talking about, or I kind of just don't feel understood when I'm talking with some people, I kind of shut down and I don't want to try as much to communicate with them or to build a bigger relationship, because I just feel like, if I'm not being understood, or if we're not interested in some of the same things, how are we ever going to be able to talk and have these conversations? Because again, communicating is super important, and while introverts may not like to sit and talk a lot, it is an essential thing to have a relationship. So just trying to be interested in it, or at least let them know that they're being understood, that you're really attentively listening to what they're saying. Obviously, you don't have to be interested in everything an introvert says. That's not what I'm saying, but like, you know, you want to feel like you're being heard and you're being understood when you're talking, and you should want to make other people feel that way as well. So it's important to give back what you are getting or what you want to get. Another thing is to speak slowly, but not too slowly. I will explain this. So introverts need time to process what is being said, what is going on in the conversation, right? They're internal processors, planners. They really need to process everything in order to fully understand it for themselves. So I'm going to give an example of when I was in college. And for me, when I would go to lectures, I really had a hard time understanding the content of everything in the lecture itself. Just because professors would talk so fast and they move through the slides so fast, and I was just like, I'm still like processing 10 slides ago and trying to like get everything to build together and connect and make sense, and it's really difficult when it's going that fast. So I had to rewatch lectures, so like thank God that they recorded their lecture and I could go back and rewatch it. But yeah, I definitely had to go back and rewatch lectures multiple times and put it on a slower speed or pause a lot just to be able to fully process. And that's kind of how introverts take in information, even when it's simple things like conversations. They need to internally process and they need that time. And obviously I'm not saying that you're going to have to repeat what you're saying, but like, if you're going to talk really fast, it's going to be, the introvert's probably going to miss a lot of things, and it's going to like get really confusing. So it's just important to kind of slow down a little bit. I'm not saying introverts are dumb by any means or that they're slow. It just, they have a different way of processing compared to extroverts, and it's just important to be mindful of that. So if you really want them to understand what you're saying and have that conversation with you, it's important to kind of slow down and kind of just like talk a little slower. I'm not saying a lot slower, but you don't want to be like talking 100 words per minute or whatever. Actually, I really don't know. Don't mind that. But yeah. However, on the other hand, you don't want to drag out a conversation or a story with unnecessary details. Because again, introverts are internal processors. So when you're kind of putting in like details that aren't important or necessary to a conversation or to a story, it takes longer for the introvert to process it, because they have to go, okay, well, that's really not necessary. Let me throw that away real quick. And all right, now what do I have? How does it all make sense together? And so, it's kind of just like essentially get to the point. You don't need all the fluff in it, because it just the details can muddle everything and make it harder to process. And I know that for me, like, I tell people this a lot, especially like my sisters. Sometimes they kind of just like can go on and on and on with a story and then almost forget what they even were gonna say to begin with. And like, I'm just sitting there and I'm like thinking, where is this going? What do I need? Like, what information do I need to retain? What is important? And I'm just like, have to stop them sometimes. I'm like, hey, can you kind of like just get to the point of what you were trying to say? Because it's becoming a lot for me to try to process and to maintain that conversation. So I know that sometimes that might seem rude, but for me, if we're having a conversation, I want to be able to participate in it if I'm interested in it, right? And if I'm not able to fully process it and understand it, then it makes it really hard for me. So that's what I would say is talk slowly, but get to the point. You don't need to add all of the extra details and all the fluff that people do sometimes. And then the next thing is to try to stay and stick with one topic at a time. I know that for extroverts, they like to cover a lot of different things in a short amount of time. They like to be broad with their conversation. They might jump from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, and maybe never even really finish a conversation before, But introverts, they really like that deep conversation, like I said before. And so, they might stay on one topic and talk about it for 20 minutes, an hour, I don't know. But they can sit there and they will talk about that one topic for a really long time. For extroverts, they may talk about it for 30 seconds and move on. But, I think it just goes to show that, you can be talking about anything and you can really dig deep into it, no matter what it is. And so, if you're just starting with small talk, like an extrovert may like and want, that can always turn into the deep, in-depth conversations that introverts need to stay stimulated in the conversation. So, you can always start with one and then really dig deep into it, right? And then, the last tip I have is for everyone, whether you're an introvert, an extrovert, an ambivert, whatever you may be. It is to be respectful of everyone's needs when it comes to communicating. And I kind of talked about this a little bit before. Everyone has different needs and different desires when it comes to communicating. And there are some things that don't fit into the categories of introvert and extrovert, right? Some people may need you to be upfront with them when something happens, while other people may just be like, no, I don't need to know about that if it's not gonna impact me, I don't need to know about it. And that doesn't really fit into those introvert-extrovert things, but it's really important to be mindful of that and respectful of that and to listen to people's needs when they're talking to you and communicating with you. When they say, I need you to communicate better this way for me in order for this to work. Because this goes for any type of relationship, whether it's your family or your friends or co-workers or a romantic relationship. Whoever it may be, it is so important to keep in mind the other person's needs when it comes to communicating, because communication is a two-way street. And if you close off one of those sides, you're only getting communication one way, and it's really hard. It's not communication then, right? It's really, really hard to maintain that relationship and to have understanding from both sides, because, again, it's just not communication. Communication involves the back and forth between two people who are willing to compromise and make changes in order to communicate. So, I just think it's so, so important to be respectful and be mindful of what people need when it comes to communicating, because communication is essential for any type of relationship. Okay. That's all I have today. So thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Heart of a Perfectionist podcast. If you enjoyed this episode or if you learned anything new, please go share it with a friend. And as always, have a good weekend. And I look forward to seeing you guys again next week on the Heart of a Perfectionist podcast.